Hi everyone, this time I'm going to talk to you about natural parallels. So that's nature and the human. And you'll already be aware if you've been following this series of presentations that we've been looking very closely at photographers who choose to capture the natural world. And that for those people who are listening from my GCSE classes, that obviously that ties in with our broader theme of a sense of place, nature. And natural parallels are a really fascinating thing. As humans, we tend to want to find human qualities in what we see. We feel very comfortable and confident when we recognise what we're looking at. And actually, I was thinking about this more broadly in life. You know, when we watch things like wildlife shows, we often want to try and personify the animals we see. And that's a really interesting thing I think all of us are guilty of in some way or another, that we want the world around us to make sense to us. And so what we do is we put ourselves into the world. Now, usually that's pretty benign, but actually, of course, human intervention in the natural world has caused nothing but devastation, really. And so it's interesting to see photographers working in such a way that not just draws our attention to beauty in nature, but also shows us the relationships between the human and nature, even when they're slightly disconcerting or uncomfortable. And when we look at a paired image such as this, where we have a natural form from the wider world and then we have a human form, we're looking immediately at something that strikes us as a visual similarity. So we're looking at the hand with the tendons, and we're likening that then to the tree with the three branches. We're finding those lines that converge or are the same. We're looking for patterns in what we see. But more than that, we are constantly looking for the human. And actually, when we look at an image such as this, I'm going to class it as a single image, even though it contains two photographs. We're seeing a world in which the human perhaps dominates. And I want you to think about that. There are some questions on the screen just now. So, for example, what feelings about nature does this photograph inspire? You know, when we're looking at this, do we feel anything of the warmth towards nature that maybe we felt when we were looking at Keith Dotson's photographs? Or do we stay very objective when we see an image like this? Is that parallel between the human and nature allowing us an objectivity of the forms we see, or does it bring us in even closer? Now, when we think about coming in close to the objects we see, of course, I'm going to cast my mind back to someone like Imogen Cunningham or Karl Blossfeldt, where we moved right into the space of the plant form. And that very intimate quality of being inside the space of the natural form was very beautiful, yes, and also made us understand, I think anyway, that we are part of nature. We're not separate to it. In this image, I get the impression, at least at first, that the human is actually separate to nature. And there's an irony there because, of course, what we're looking at is something that is incredibly similar. But with that division line between the two images and the diptych form, I'm actually starting to question whether we're the same at all. And again, thinking back to somebody we've already studied, someone like Victoria Staponi, for example, who really immersed her models sort of texturally and compositionally into the frame of nature. I wonder if we respond differently to these photographs than we do to hers. So again, thinking very much about, are we separate to nature or are we part of it? Are we looking at it as something external, or do we feel it within ourselves? And the last question on the slide is there a nature or human bias in this work? And when I look at it, although the photographs within the diptych are equally sized, and although there is obviously that visual correlation, I really feel that the human has a power here. Perhaps that's because in the case of the human form, we've had to zoom right into the hand to see it in great detail. Whereas we do have an element of distance between us and that tree. And that sense of closeness, again, perhaps subconsciously even, may create the feeling that we are close, intimate, cognizant with what is human, but that we're further away from and therefore separate to what is nature. And the photographer shooting in this way, Alicja Brodowicz from Poland, is really, really clever at being able to find these visual relationships between nature and human. And I had a really long conversation with my class about these images, and also about what words we should use in order to talk about what it is that's actually going on within the frame. And again, I'm using the word frame to describe both images contained as if they are one. Like, is there actually a relationship between what is human and nature? Is there a correlation between purely visual elements? Is there any meaning in this work? I think it's fair to say that when I first saw some of these photographs, I was quite dismissive, actually, of what I was seeing. I thought, yeah, very clever. Someone's invested time in finding these correlations between shapes or textures. But I perhaps didn't look long enough to really unpack or peel back the layers of what I was thinking. I think that's a really, really good practice for all photographers, actually, when looking at other people's work, is to think of what we're looking at as a many-layered thing. So my dismissiveness was my problem. You know, when I returned to the images and I looked again, there were all kinds of questions that started to come up. And also, of course, I'm in the fortunate position that through talking with my classes, lots of other elements of what I'm looking at become more obvious in dialogue with others. So, for example, the image in the middle at the top. At first, I wasn't especially aware that that is a rock surface and then a skin surface. I wasn't really invested in looking at the textural quality of the rock for any other reason than that it's what I could see. But then when I thought about it in context of there being stretch marks on a human body, and I spent longer looking, I spent longer thinking and digesting what I was seeing, the more I started to question whether I was looking at something that was in fact beautiful. I started to question whether I was looking at something that was about a bias, as I mentioned in the previous slide, whether I was looking at something that was speaking to our need to belong somehow. We tend to find that we belong when we feel we're the same. And here we are being led to a point where we see that we perhaps are the same. We're very similar to this other thing that we may often believe to be external to us. And also in dialogue with my class, I was fascinated with what they started talking about to do with beauty. It was amazing to me how quickly, when I showed this slide, we started using the word beauty, actually. That immediately we kind of have this language we use when discussing or describing nature. We revert to beauty, and that's a really lovely thing, of course. And I'm not sure that all humans would use that language necessarily when talking about beauty, but my students do. They talk about beauty. And what came up was that maybe there's an element of squeamishness in what we're looking at with Brodowicz's work. We're seeing something that doesn't show us perfection. And of course, then there's a conversation about whether beauty is perfection or perfection is beauty. I mean, for example, the stretch marks, you know, human bodies, we have them. We grow, we change, our bodies stretch, our skin has those markings on it. You know, when have we ever seen a fashion shoot where we can so intensely or intently look at stretch marks? You know, there is something that, especially women, are trained to kind of dislike about their bodies after they've had a child, for example. And likewise, when we look at the image at the bottom in the middle, we're looking at those feet, those gnarled, arthritic feet. Are we seeing something that makes us feel repulsed? Do we turn away from it? Are we drawn to it more because there's something kind of ghoulish and odd about what we're looking at, therefore we're fascinated by it? Or are we observing what we see, finding the parallel between that kind of funny potato with the sprouts on it, and are we seeing it for exactly what it is? That actually there is beauty still in something that is grotesque. And I think I talked a little about this when we were looking at Dotson's work, and he photographed a dying flower. That dying flower isn't the one you'd pick in the florist to put in a vase on your table. Nonetheless, it had its own quality of beauty. And perhaps in these images, there's a sense of fierce grace about what happens with our bodies. Our bodies are shown in a light that isn't necessarily flattering. And one of my students said something that was really, really insightful, which was in the pairing of these images. Perhaps we're seeing that humans aren't worthy to be compared to nature. I really stayed with that for a long time. That by showing things about the human body, the physical vehicle that isn't immediately beautiful, isn't recognisably beautiful or satisfying in the context of beauty, conventions of beauty, that actually the photographer maybe is suggesting to us that we're not worthy. So where initially my own experience being brought to the images, I was quite dismissive, suddenly this whole world of understanding and meaning is opened up for me. As I said, really fortunate to have a class I can talk to about these things, because I now see that these photographs are much cleverer in a meaningful way than I at first assumed. It's not just about the visual. But Brodowicz isn't the only person who's working in this way. And if I show you this, another Polish photographer, Agnieszka Lipka, again, very similar, this time in colour. There's no divisible white line between the images. We just go straight from one into the other. Again, we're seeing this relationship. And just there, it says, in her ongoing series titled Human versus Nature, Lipka works with the similarities between the human being and Mother Nature. Veins are put into relation with topographic maps, fingerprints resemble a tree trunk, and cacti are compared to scrubby beards. Now, again, first glance, I'm making a comparison between Brodowicz and Lipka. I'm saying one's in colour, one's in black and white. I've by default gone back to just talking about the visual. But actually, there's something else here that's vitally important, and it's to do with how this work is titled. Human versus Nature. The artist has chosen to give us a title that immediately sets the human at odds with nature. And again, speaking to my students, we discussed this idea that there's a rivalry between humans and nature. There's a constant battle, this oscillation between who's in control of the planet. We as humans have tried to tame nature. We often hear things about the fact that nature can't be tamed, that it will rise up. And even though these are very quiet photographs in one sense, very muted colours, very kind of bleached away sense in it, nonetheless they're kind of roaring with this inference that we are at odds. So actually, although there are similarities, we couldn't be further from each other. That's kind of depressing, actually, when you think about it. We couldn't be further from the natural world in these photographs, even though we can see these visual relationships. And then from Italy, Tommaso Proietti, the work you can see in the largest image, we're going to talk about in another presentation another time, but obviously that's a double exposure format where we have the ocean interlaid with a portrait. Very clever way for the artist to assert that we are actually nature, we are part of nature, there's no separation at all. But in the work you can see on the screen now that's above me, where we have the lightning bolt and we have the veins in the wrist, the human wrist, there is obviously immediately a likeness between what Brodowicz and Lipka are doing. Yes, because of the paired imagery, and yes, because of looking for those similarities in composition and the continuity of line, for example. But to me, actually, this work is so much more immediately obvious as being something that's meaningful. in terms of how humans are nature compared to what Brodowicz is doing, for example. And that's because when we look at this image and we see that lightning, unlike the other work we see, Brodowicz's work with the feet or the back or the stubble or the stretch marks, or even with Lepke's eyes or fingerprint, these things are elements that can be controlled extremely easily. You know, the cracked earth isn't going to whisk off somewhere. The tree stump with the time rings on it isn't suddenly going to evaporate or disappear. Whereas with that lightning strike, there's something so spontaneous, unbridled, that really perhaps is the essence of nature. It's alive. That speaks to me much more about the essence of being alive, that nature is alive, as are we, and therefore the relationship between us as a human form and as a natural form or as an element of nature is compressed. There isn't a separation anymore. So, going back to Brodowicz, she said herself, I combine the two images looking for converging lines, textures, similarities in layout and analogies in composition between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And just a note on that, when you read more widely about Brodowicz and her work, when she uses the word microcosm, she's talking about the human, she's talking about that very small, closed down, finite form that is the human vehicle. And the macrocosm, rather, is about the whole of nature. So when she talks about microcosm and macrocosm, already she's kind of setting us at odds there. And she goes on to say, I look for unity between the human body and the nature. I thought that was a really interesting way for her to phrase what she does. Because the way she has described her practice is, again, creating a separation between human and nature. So although there's a unity, there's not immersion. Although there's a unity between that human body and nature, the word between still sets us apart. And also the fact that she titles the human body and the nature kind of puts us on separate poles. It's very subtle, but I think it's really useful to think about that. And when I was thinking about our need as humans to project the human into whatever we look at, and especially when we look at nature to try and sort of personify things or find these relationships, I thought back to one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. That's Edward Weston's Pepper, number 30. I suppose most photography students will see this at some point. A lot of people are familiar with this image. Weston spent quite a lot of time being really annoyed by critics and viewers who insisted that in his depiction of the pepper, he was in actual fact making a sort of statement of the erotic, or there was something kind of sexual in that image. Now, that says a lot, of course, about the person who's looking at the pepper, perhaps more than it says about Weston, because Weston was insistent that the pepper was just a pepper. And it was really interesting, speaking to my class again, that if we were to give the Weston pepper the same treatment as Brodowicz's work, and we were to say, right, here is a form and how do we correlate that with something else, that actually all of my students could see two figures. And time again, actually, what came up was a mother and child, or a parent and child in some kind of embrace. I mean, personally, when I look at it and I project something humanoid into it, I see a single form, a rounded back with a spine and the arms up. Perhaps a woman tying her long hair or something. But actually, you can see on the screen there as well, there's a longer quote about how Weston felt about this pepper. It says, it is a classic, completely satisfying, a pepper, but more than a pepper. Abstract in that it is completely outside subject matter. It has no psychological attributes. By the way, I don't agree with that. I'll come back to that in a minute. No human emotions are aroused I also don't agree with that. This new pepper takes one beyond the world we know in the conscious mind. I do agree with that. Just to take that apart a little bit, I really do think that most of the time humans are looking and they're searching when they're looking. And what they're searching for is usually themselves. I think we see truth in that. Whenever we see something, we are projecting into it who we are. Sometimes when we're being very thoughtful, we might consider who the maker is. I mean that in terms of like the photographer or the painter. But very often that's unconscious. So that sort of final little section, this new pepper takes one beyond the world we know in the conscious mind. I do agree with that. You know, our unconscious is speaking to us when we see this. We're finding those relationships. We're looking for something in this photograph. Even pepper number 30. Of course, pepper number 30, I should say. Anyway, he goes on to say, but this one takes one into an inner reality, the absolute, with a clear understanding, a mystic revealment. This is the significant presentation that I mean. The presentation through one's intuitive self, seeing through one's eyes, not with them, the visionary. Now, I really do think that any photographer ought to have that somehow tattooed on their body so that they remember always that there is a significant presentation and we are seeing through one's eyes, not with them. In that what we see and we capture is then given out into the world for others to see. And that through that seeing, or that process of seeing, do we really see the world afresh, or do we just see the same things over and over? This is a fascinating thing to discuss, actually, that, you know, when we're looking, are we really looking? You know, are we looking to find something new, or are we just looking to be comforted? And when we look at nature and we want to be comforted, maybe nature doesn't want to comfort us anymore. We've been so mean to it. And maybe in those quiet spaces, when we enter the realm of the pepper, or we enter the realm of the succulent as photographed by Imogen Cunningham, for example, we enter a space that is not just reciprocal in the movement between the human and the natural form, but that actually we are just the same thing. And there's something really beautiful about that. I said earlier, when I looked at Lepke's work, for example, I could be almost quite depressed when I was looking at it, when I really thought about what it could perhaps reveal about the relationship between a separate human and a planet or a nature that is so much more worthy than we are. But here I am, and that space between me and the world is collapsed. Anyway, your task. As usual, if you're in my GCSE class, you're going to be preparing a PowerPoint presentation so that whilst we're still in lockdown, I can see it from home. I want you to produce 4 high quality, perfect quality photographs that demonstrate the visual link between human and nature forms. So of course, that is very much working in the style of Brodowicz. Finding the correlations, finding the relationships between surfaces, lines, things like that. And I want you to write an overview of the photographers working to convey nature and human, focusing especially on Brodowicz. Now, so far, so relatively easy, I think. So for Stretch and Challenge, which most of you will attempt, I want you to create a series of images that combine notions put forward by Brodowicz with those demonstrated by Karl Blossfeldt, Imogen Cunningham, and or Keith Dotson. Now, through that Stretch and Challenge task, what I'm really asking you to do is draw meaning back into the space and in the relationship you find between the plant form or the natural form and the human form, rather than just focusing on those visual correlations, that you actually really go into the notions about being separate or indeed being part of nature. So as usual, if I was in class and I was demonstrating, I went straight into the stretching challenge, of course, and I used some gladioli that I had at home. You can see on the screen there at the top in the corner above me, that was just my scene. I put the vase on the floor at home. I had my black fabric. I experimented with different light forms. I really did want to kind of create some drama with these flowers. But actually I found when I illuminated from single source light, I didn't get what I wanted. I got too much bounce back on the black fabric. And so in the end, I actually ended up photographing at night, but using just my overhead spotlights. And what I did was I closed down some of the light with an assistant holding the black fabric kind of over a certain part. And I think you can see on the largest image that what happened there is that one particular stem of the gladioli is really brightly illuminated, whereas the rest has this kind of very neutral light. It's almost like absent light. It's like you don't even know it's there. And in post-production, all I did was I raised my contrast just slightly so that any creases in my black fabric just completely disappear. So it goes back to black. Now that links immediately to Imogen Cunningham for me. So in that mashup between photographers, this idea of like art maths where I'm adding ideas from different people, I'm looking at Brodowicz, and you'll see this in a second, but I'm going back to Imogen Cunningham, who I love. So this is how I paired it. Again, this is not a perfect image, this is just my demonstration. I was also, by this point, when I shot the hands, I was only shooting my own hands by myself, and that was really, really difficult because I couldn't get my camera far enough away from me to then also stretch my fingers out in the same way that those gladioli stems were kind of stretched out. But what I did, of course, think about as a relationship is there are 10 fingers, there were 10 stems, there is this kind of elongation, these kind of long, narrow forms. And I put them together. So that's my pairing. The other thing I did here was I didn't keep the white line to divide them. Because for me personally, if I was thinking about meaning that I want to convey through my work, I do want to suggest that I am nature. I'm not separate to it. I'm part of the same landscape. And that in itself, and if we take that even further, I could say that actually in that black space I've created by not having the diptych form with the line down the middle, is that I have a landscape format as well, almost like a panorama of a landscape that, although black, back to black, creates this illusion, like maybe again of like a timelessness. I belong to no time, I'm part of nature and nature is endless. So that is what I have been making. So back to your task, just to recap. You're going to prepare your work as a PowerPoint as usual, produce 4 high quality photographs that demonstrate the visual link between human and nature forms, writing an overview of the photographers working to convey nature and human, focusing especially on Brodowicz. And then the stretching challenge, which is the thing I really think you will probably want to get your teeth into, is to create a series of images that combine notions put forward by Brodowicz with those demonstrated by Blossfeldt, Cunningham, and or Dotson, or of course the pony. So, my initial photographs, my final outcome. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you produce as usual, and good luck.